Hello and welcome back to the City UK National Conference 2020, our lunchtime session on levelling up the UK. I'm Andy Bounds. I'm the Financial Times Enterprise Editor and North of England Correspondent. I'm very pleased those two things go together. This is a statement that there is a heck of a lot of enterprise outside the M25, and we're going to talk about how to get more of it. And especially the role of industry in supporting the post-pandemic recovery across the UK regions and nations. I'd like to thank our sponsors today. You can see them there on the screen. We have BNP Paribas, Platinum Partner, Gold Partners, BNY Mellon, DLA Piper, and Yorkshire Building Society. And I'm also very pleased that this is one of many sessions on this important topic about how we create prosperity across the country. That the City UK has focused on. So we have three speakers today, and after that we will take questions from the audience, and I will ask some questions. We'll be going for about 45 minutes. There will also be a couple of questions for you in the audience to answer during the session, so keep your eye out for those. So my three panelists are Baroness Valentine, who is Director of Place for Business in the Community, which has a national footprint in delivering change for poorer areas across the country and showing how business can support people in those areas. Sandra Wallace is the City UK City Chair for Birmingham and a partner at DLA Piper, the law firm. And Simon Williams, Executive Director and Co-Head of National Markets for BNP Paribas Real Estate. So I'm going to turn to Sandra first to open up for us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and welcome to the conference. It's my first virtual national conference, having attended all the ones previously. And the national conference was born out of the City UK's strategy to move and to have local chairs regionally, because as a regional strategy, that was something that they thought was critical given the number of jobs in the sector that were outside of London. And I'm based in Birmingham. I have an international role is at the firm of UK and Europe Managing Director, and so my role and the firm's position in that is that regions are really important, just as London is, to a strategy across the UK for levelling up. And I think this topic couldn't be any more important at the moment. We've seen that 63% of people or households are on reduced income resulting from COVID. Apprenticeships take-up is almost half what it was last year, and people are using savings to just keep themselves at cost of living standards. So it couldn't be any more important, the agenda that we're looking at right now on levelling up. And what I would like to say really as an opening on this agenda is that to take it forward, either as government or as employers, we have to have a regional approach, because levelling up it's certainly across the UK, it's a very mixed picture. It's something that is critical in certain areas than others. And if we take this as a governmental approach, I fear that we won't look at some of the nuances that this industry faces and that the UK faces. And I think this sector has a really important part to play in working on that levelling up agenda that the government has set out. It's a crucial sector in terms of the export.
Sandra's got a slight problem with the line there. I hope we can get her back. In the meantime, while we try and work on getting her back, I think I'm going to turn to Baroness Valentine. I think we've got the sense of what Sandra was saying about the crucial nature of this agenda. So, Baroness, can you give us your thoughts, please?
Yes, I hope you can hear me okay, because I'm not actually in the country at the moment. But, I hope I have a unique perspective on this issue, because I inhabit the Westminster bubble. I've been an investment banker, and I've spent time in some of Britain's forgotten places. So as Director of Place at Business in the Community, which is one of a mixture of things I do, I seek to bring business together with the local authority and with the voluntary sector in places to address what those places see as their challenges and opportunities. So I'm just going to make a few comments that I hope are pertinent to the conversation. When I sit in those places that are called left behind towns or forgotten places, one feels very far away from the Westminster bubble and indeed from the city, as in the City of London. So it's all very well for the government to have grand challenges for the plans to upskill the workforce, artificial intelligence, you name it. But for those with grandpa living in the front room, the grand challenge can feel more like, how am I going to get food on the table tomorrow? So I think the grand challenge post-COVID is for both business and government really to reach out to these communities that understand life from their end of the telescope. We've seen some of the same issues with Black Lives Matter and people feeling disempowered and alienated. So my challenge to the city community would be, just to take one example, do you really know what it would take for the Asian community in the Leeds city region just to have a proportionate share of the finance-related jobs available there? Is there something you can do to make that more likely? That seems to me an example of an ambition which reflects the desire to build back better and more responsibility. Otherwise, life in Britain remains a them and us.
That's a very good point, Baroness Valentine, and I'm sure we'll get into that. I'm pleased to see Sandra back. We could talk about levelling up broadband connections across the UK, but we'll leave that for another panel. So I'll turn to Simon now, and your observations, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably just worth saying where I come from within the organisation of BNP Paribas, and I'm on the real estate advisory side of things, working in the UK, principally in markets, in real estate markets outside of central London. And we've been involved in regeneration projects over the last few years with private sector partnerships, putting together quite ambitious proposals in places like Sunderland and Sheffield, Middlesbrough, other places. And one thing we've learned from all that, I think, is about the importance of the public sector and private sector working together. In some of these places, you know, particularly from a real estate perspective, you know, the market doesn't particularly function at all, never mind in favour of those who need it to function most. And I think the only way to unlock that is to try and harness, you know, often the resources and capital that the private sector and expertise can bring together with some of the sort of key interventions that the public sector channeled quite often through local authorities and other sort of public sector bodies to sort of come together in a constructive way. The second thing that we've done, because obviously levelling up has been on the agenda now for a little while, it's not a recent thing, is we did some of our own research called NextX last year, which looked at the vitality of places from all sorts of angles, from, you know, the air quality through to clearly, you know, housing stock and all sorts of other things. We even did a Gindex, which looked at the sort of vitality of, you know, new private and sort of microbreweries and that sort of thing, just to see how exciting places were to live in. And one of the sort of interesting things I think I observed from that was that levelling up's not only between the regions, but there's also huge disparities within those regions as well. You know, within the Northwest, there is a huge difference between living in Manchester and some of the other towns and places within those regions. So I think when we're looking at some of the initiatives that the government have got in its mind at the moment, particularly in terms of infrastructure, we've got to remember that can't all be channeled towards the big and sort of exciting places. We've got to remember those places that has just been, you know, somebody just observed that, you know, the left behind places, they're as important if we're going to make this work, I think.
Yeah, so just on what businesses can do practically, I mean, Sandra, you're sitting in Birmingham doing international work. HSBC famously moved its UK HQ to Birmingham. It all seems to have gone smoothly. I often report about, you know, TalkTalk, for example, has moved its head office to Manchester. But you always seem to get one or two of these examples, and you expect a flood to follow, and it never quite happens. So I just wondered what holds back the industry from, you know, London's an expensive place to do business. We don't want to, you know, there are certain things you can only do in London, but there's plenty of stuff that could be easily done elsewhere at lower cost with possibly better staff retention, and yet never quite seems to happen. I just wonder what the barriers were to that.
I think some of the barriers are from taking a siloed approach, that sometimes we don't, as industries, working across together. And in Birmingham, that's one of the things that we are trying to do with, for example, the West Midlands Combined Authority and LEP. We're working really hard to cross-industry collaboration so that we can talk about the benefits of the local economies, we can talk about the strengths of those local economies and sort of go to market together. But sometimes I think we haven't done that as well as we should. And we can really address problems as well, levelling up, some of the issues that we see on levelling up, if we have that collaborative approach. And I think that is very much starting, certainly in the region that I'm in. And I think we can take those ideas forward. There are some things, as you say, Andrew, that absolutely London is still critical for as an international level, but we can definitely leverage our abilities and talents and the skills agenda if we have a more regional approach.
Simon, I wonder if you had a view on that as somebody who advises people on where to invest.
Yeah, I think what we may see, and we're going to see some things stay the same after the COVID crisis is over, and hopefully we are coming to an end fairly soon, and we're going to see other things which might change. And I think one of the sort of opportunities for the regions is actually to try and make quite a compelling case for not having all your eggs in one basket, and that's both in terms of, you know, cost, obviously, with the economy probably it's going to take some time to get back to where we were before the pandemic, but also just in terms of having a strategy to overcome this sort of having such a devastating impact in the future. So, you know, it might be that people have a hub and spoke approach where they have obviously still got operations in London, but sort of think much more about where they can actually, you know, put other parts of their operation elsewhere in the UK, because there is the talent. Obviously, we need to work hard on connecting that talent up, both physically and in terms of IT, and also making sure that the facilities are there for businesses to actually take advantage of, be that in terms of office space or decent housing and education.
Baroness Valentine, have you got any thoughts on that relocation issue?
Yes, well, I completely agree with Sandra's point about getting people to work together across sectors, and actually Simon made the point in his opening remarks about the need for public and private sectors to work together. And generally, to begin with, there's a sort of cultural gap in understanding which needs working on, so people will respect each other's strengths and what they can bring to the party. So I completely agree with that at local level. In my experience, after sometimes a bit of a bumpy start, that's quite easy to make work at local level. You come then to national government, which keeps telling local people they need to work together if they're going to address these things. I don't see any evidence of national government working together in a constructive way to support regions. So I think there's a question back to government, having said, you know, you go and sort yourselves out. Who is levelling up czar? Can that person tell what should happen in skills, what should happen in housing? Others, I won't go into housing, but there's a whole thing there. But on the other point that was being made about relocation, I think people just, there's a sort of lag factor with people not being imaginative about where they can put their offices. I sat on the HS2 board, in fact, and I think that does make that sort of transport link does make a huge difference to people's confidence, partly in areas. Actually, with the digital, with people having made a leap on digital during the COVID crisis, I do think now that somewhere like Blackpool, which is where I was working most recently, which has just got a mega fast cable being laid from New York to Blackpool, bizarrely, and where the seaside air is just heavenly if you're like me and normally in London. So, you know, air quality, complete converse. And actually it's a fun place because it's a sort of centre of entertainment. So I just think people need to start thinking a bit differently. And let's take advantage of the changes.
Yeah, and we've got a question on that theme. which asks about, you know, how the pandemic might change this now that we're all used to working remotely, and maybe commuting into an office every day is not going to be required. Will that exacerbate? We've seen lots of trends like internet shopping and so on, fueled and exacerbated by this pandemic. Is that one that might stay? I don't know if anyone wants to take that one on. I think Simon might be. Oh, sorry.
I mean, I was just going to say, certainly as our law firm, we are now looking at a strategy for the Office of the Future. And we were already implementing agile working, looking at where we should base ourselves, and working in a more agile way. And this has absolutely accelerated that, because unfortunately that was always seen as something that women would do, and childcare and so on. And finally, we've been able to consign that notion to the bin and show that everyone can work flexibly and everybody can do it effectively. What we mustn't make sure we lose is the collaboration and the culture and the togetherness that comes with an office. But I think there's absolutely opportunity to build on what we're doing, what we've seen we've had to do as part of the pandemic. And I think it's important on a skills basis as well, because if people are looking at levelling up, they can look to regions that they wouldn't ordinarily have looked to find their talent, areas that suffer from unemployment, where this sector particularly could really draw talent from, and not require those people to move or not be in an office all the time. So I think this is a real opportunity if we get it right. It's not the end of the office by any means, but it's a real opportunity for this agenda.
Simon, I think you might have personal experience in this field.
Well, I do a bit, because I, for many years, have been, in the week I live in London, and at the weekend I live in Chester, where I'm sitting at the moment, actually. And clearly that's a 2-hour journey on a Monday, and then later on in the week, usually on a Thursday or a Friday. And so I've been sort of dabbling with, at the day home working for years and years and years, and it works very well. But you do need a balance. I think Sandra's absolutely right. People need to be in the office for that collaboration, for that sort of culture, and also for learning. And I think also what we tend to forget when we're all sitting there together in an office, young and old, and I speak as one of the older people in my office, is that the younger people absorb quite a lot of sort of information and learn in an almost imperceptible but very valuable way when people are together and talking and doing work and so on. And so I think the office has a very vital role in that sense. But, like most things, we have to evolve. And I think what COVID has done in all sorts of areas is accelerate the speed of the way that we're evolving. We've seen it in retail, we're seeing it in the office. We'll see it in some other areas as well. I think, as Sandra's pointed out, the role of, both partners in the home, if people are lucky enough to have a sort of family with 2 parents and kids and so on. So I think there's all sorts of things that, we've got to look at the positives, I think, out of all the change that is going on, and try and sort of build on that so that we have a better future, really. But I do think the office has a big role to play still. It's certainly not going to become extinct.
But I'll just move on to another question we've been asked as well, which is similar, and it's what's sometimes sort of called the second job problem. You might hire a bright young graduate trainee in a regional office. They do 3 or 4 years, prove themselves, they're looking to move on, and so often that big job requires a move to London. So has anyone, cracked that problem? And sometimes it's about the cluster you're in as well. So it might be that you are a great law firm, but there's no other great law firms around. So even if they wanted to leave you to go to another one to progress their career, that possibility just isn't there.
I was going to say I can just sort of speak a little bit about some personal experience on a project I've worked on over the last few years with Sheffield University, and they've had a very far-sighted sort of approach to collaborating on the R&D side with industry. And I think the current Vice-Chancellor is very new, but the one who's just retired was very keen not only to create jobs for the graduates that they produce as they come straight out of university, but he was interested in 2nd, 3rd and 4th jobs, because I think what he was keen to make sure was that they didn't lose that skill from the local economy, mainly because, the university also needs some of the thinking and some of the innovation that sort of, local businesses produce in order to take their thinking forward on the R&D side as well. So I think, you know, again, we go back to this word collaboration, but, you know, at the higher education and further education sector, and obviously local government, key and central government too, have a key part to play in this. I think that is a very good point.
Baroness Valentine,
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, I was just reflecting on it because I obviously ran London First for many years, and the agglomeration of talent you get in London definitely has a pull. I was just reflecting while you were talking. I mean, I think we can all work more flexibly now, and you can very much see people spending 4 days, say, in a home which might be Blackpool, and then taking the train to London 3 days to work. You know, you can see people being more flexible about how you mix and match where you are and where you work. I mean, I've partly loved lockdown. I mean, just struggling on the tube day after day. You know, and I'm sitting in fresh air here. So I do think one can balance these things out. I also want to make a point about Sandra was touched on this regional presence. The question you've asked the audience is about what policy should be changed to help level up. I do think getting powerful people out of London or powerful institutions out of London is part of the equation. And I think, you know, there's this aim yet again to push civil service jobs out of London. You know, part of me says good luck with that. But really, you know, when I'm having a meeting with ministers in, let's change the place, in Bradford, the chances they will cancel are higher than if I'm having a meeting with ministers in London. And you understand why that is, but really, you know, you need to think about this, the whole way the system operates. Everybody is second-class citizen to Westminster, so that's sort of automatic, I guess. But, you know, you sort of have to work against the natural inertia of the system. I think government definitely has to do that. And hopefully business can be more imaginative about it.
Yes, I remember talking to one of the professional services firms who said if they ever have a pan-northern get-together, they often do it in London because it's actually easier for everyone. You know, Newcastle and Manchester want to meet, and Liverpool. It's quicker for them all to go to London than it is to get to, you know, meet somewhere like Leeds. So, Sandra, I think you probably have something to add on this second job thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think, as I said at the beginning, if you heard me, if I hadn't dropped off by then, I think the City UK, one of the reasons I became chair was because of the regional strategy that they adopted some years ago. And I'm in my role as UK and Europe managing director. Don't know who I am now. In that role, I was asked several times, "What, you're doing that from Birmingham?" And I will tell everybody that will listen that I do this job from Birmingham. I'm here now because it's so important that especially young people see their ability to work regionally and not just in London. And I, with my other hat on, I'm also a social mobility commissioner. We did a report that made clear that most people that are likely to move up, to move out, to move up, are those from a more privileged background, and those that are less likely to move are those that haven't got the wherewithal to move and to move more locally, move to London and places like that, and therefore they stay in areas that may be in disadvantage. So this whole idea of, you know, is a critical one. And if we're talking about a levelling up agenda, we have to make sure we have that people like us, law firms like us, professional services have a regional agenda and a presence.
Baroness Valentine, you must have done a lot of cross, you know, collaborations on the ground on skills and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's skills and schools, isn't there? Typically, you'll find in one of the sort of more distant places that aspirations are low. I mean, you do get this cycle of talent drain and then low aspirations. So it's a tough one. I think it's a really core issue. And I guess typically I would start in the schools on that subject because you need to be working on attitude aspiration quite early on, I think. I mean, I've made the point before, but it does seem to be these sort of grand policies that come out of national organisations just don't play realistically down at ground level. And so I think the Careers and Enterprise Company does a really good job of just working with local schools, getting the standards up, making sure they meet for business people, just sort of bog standard stuff. And I wish more effort from, I don't know, whether it's the Department for Education or whatever, could really go into really making a difference on the ground. But anyway, so I mean, so I would say to any business group in any region, if you want to get onto this subject, find out how your schools are doing on what's called the Gatsby benchmarks, which is about getting people ready for employment, and help get the school children in your region up to the right level of contact with business, being mentored by business people, etc., etc. So that's almost my number one issue. And then if you move to skills, clearly you need digital skills for the future now. So there's going to be a load of reskilling. A lot of people having lost jobs and then having to go into new types of jobs. So there's some core skills that people need, additional skills, but the sort of communication and project management and those skills people have talked about before. There's a whole new area post-COVID of reskilling people again. We're sort of going through the whatever the COVID revolution is after the digital revolution, which is a bit of you're looking at a range of skills from technical skills at one end of the spectrum and having the right skills for the financial sector through to just having a set of basic skills that's needed for a modern workforce.
Thank you very much. We now have the second question, which is on the green growth agenda. How fast do you see the implementation of the green growth agenda, which obviously is being announced today, not least in the page of the Financial Times by the Prime Minister? So the government's not just dropped its boycott of the Today programme, but seems to be the FT's back in vogue as well. How fast do you see the implementation of the green growth agenda in terms of the development of the Northern Powerhouse? And there's a choice of how many years you might think that will take. Now, obviously, the City UK, a lot of it is about finance. The banks, from my reporting, have always spread their lending quite proportionally across the country. So if you want to get a bit of debt from a bank, you're just as likely probably to get it in Blackpool as you are in London. But venture capital and growth capital is another thing entirely, and it's still heavily dominated by London and South East, despite the burgeoning tech scenes in many of our northern and midland cities. And I just wondered if any of you had any ideas about how that getting capital to growing businesses can be achieved. I might start with Simon on that one, if that's all right.
Yeah, I mean, from a real estate perspective, I think again, it's a public and private partnership approach, really. I mean, the fact is, I suppose, that most of the people who are key decision makers, as we've already sort of mentioned on this panel, tend to be based in London, quite often in the city. And so clearly, there's a bit of inertia there, isn't there? Because they live in the southeast and in London in particular, and so therefore they feel that they understand what they're investing in perhaps intrinsically better because they live there than they would if they were doing it elsewhere across the UK. So I think what they need is a bit of a comfort blanket, to be frank with you. Certainly on the real estate side, they probably need to have maybe some key interventions on critical and probably strategic projects where the local authorities, perhaps with some help from central government, are providing some sort of guarantor over the income generated to pay back some of this investment and loan and create a return might be appropriate. But in terms of startup businesses and so on, I think again we probably need to have, and I think the idea of a levelling up czar is great. So we probably need to have some sort of initiative where the sort of £100 billion for the levelling up agenda, which the government are talking about rolling out over several different initiatives over the next few years, is focused so that we can start to generate quality jobs and economic prosperity through investment in startups which address some of the opportunities which you know, the quite exciting age of post-COVID digitisation and so on, you know, are going to offer us, and the green agenda as well. I mean, there's some fantastic companies who are looking to try and get involved in, you know, delivering things like offshore wind power to the UK, and we can be a world leader in that if we get involved now. I think some great things in the north, by the way. The question that was just asked about how quickly will it take off in the north. You know, there's the Energy Central site, for example, in Blythe Valley, which obviously became famous briefly on election night, where they've got a deep water dock which can help service bringing in the energy that's going to be created on the new Dogger Bank wind farm, which could be fantastic. There's going to be all sorts of industries located there, which will help to service that green energy industry, which I think is the future.
Sandra?
I think it's a really good point, and I would like to come back to something Baroness Valentine said, which is people are still going to look to London if everything feels like it's centralised there. And if the government had a seat that wasn't in London and people felt that the government were taking it seriously, we would see some of this, these industries and sectors move out of London and take up the opportunities that do exist regionally. So for my mind, they should get on with looking at moving and having some centre of government
Yeah, there are plans to have an economic campus, as they call it, of the Treasury and the Business Department based somewhere in the north. And I think maybe the Communities Department will be part of it as well. And Boris Johnson has talked about moving ministers, God forbid, as well as just senior civil servants. I guess it's very hard when Parliament has to be, you know, if we now have a virtual Parliament, maybe there's more chance of getting Secretaries of State to move out of London. Baroness Valentine, did you have any thoughts on you know, getting finance into these communities and their growing companies?
Well, first of all, can I say I'm very pro Parliament in whatever form moving out of London. I think that's a very good thing. I mean, if you think of the power bases of London, you've essentially got three. You've got the government, you've got the city, and you've got higher education. And so I'm just reflecting on higher education because I think possibly they could be more of a catalyst in what you're talking about. You know, you have technology transfer, but I don't think government is as smart as it could be at leveraging that to really get some of this activity going into places other than London. I was also reflecting on the ecosystem you need to make these things happen. So, you know, if you've got a great little green energy business in St Austell, say, if you've not got the people around you, other people doing the same sort of job, the people who are used to investing in that stuff, it's all a bit lonely. So I think one has to create, one has to either artificially really stretch out, or one has to create some ecosystems. And I quite like, I mean, a virtual ecosystem, something like tech on so there's a bit of that. But I think it's a bit non-trivial. I think government probably could and should do more to push it in that direction and try and force. I mean, you've got the Eden project going to Morecambe. You know, if you could put a little cluster around that, which really got exciting. You've got lots of offshore wind around there, and then it begins to sound exciting.
Yes, I think the whole cluster thing is fascinating. I've covered many a story where you find, I mean, there's one in Cumbria, which is very advanced for lighting. They've got 3 or 4 companies. And because they have people leave one company and start up another, you get these sort of mini expertise, which is world leading, and it just needs a bit of support sometimes when it's a bit subscale. The other thing to say on investing in the north, particularly, I mean, I've covered the arrival of a couple of international mid-market private equity houses who thought London was too competitive and too overpriced, and just went straight for to invest in the north, because if you look at it if you take it out of the UK, it's quite a significant economy, the North and Midlands, and quite a productive economy, and it's a lot of international people tend to look at it almost as a separate thing, and they can see good value in it. So the more foreign investment, the better. Simon, you've probably got experience.
I was just nodding only because yeah, in the real estate world, I've done a bit of work over the years with Beijing Construction, whose philosophy actually in the UK, and they're, I think, a distant arm of the Chinese state, but nevertheless they're a very powerful and well-organised construction and development company. Their strategy is to concentrate on the northern powerhouse in terms of where they want to do business, because they see that as the most exciting part of the UK economy from a sort of construction point of view for them. So absolutely, it's, you know, if you look at the sort of size of the economy and the numbers of people who live across the north and the Midlands, it's big in European terms, and actually the economy is big in world terms. So there should be plenty of things that can be made attractive for overseas investment to come here.
And on staying with property, we've had a question about, you know, whether, again, the pandemic and the way of working will slightly change where people invest and where they see potential in the property market.
Yeah, it's been interesting over the last 6 months. I think the market itself, for obvious reasons, is a lot smaller this year than it traditionally is, probably about half the size in terms of investment volumes, so down in the 30 billions as opposed to up in the 60 plus billion sort of range. And I think what we've seen is a sort of concentration on sort of operational property and property that sort of revolves around where people live or where people are going to live. So, you know, the residential sector's been very, you know, done quite well, and there's a lot of investment appetite. Obviously, for obvious reasons, because most people are getting things delivered when they buy stuff at the moment. The industrial and logistics sector has again been in incredibly high demand, and there's been record levels of take-up from tenants in that area too. And for that reason, those sort of sectors have become a bit more expensive. They've actually increased in value since the lockdown, whilst retail and arguably offices in some areas have probably decreased a bit, and also in the hospitality sector. What we're seeing now, though, is as news of things like the vaccines is coming through and people are beginning to see their way through all of this, the appetite is returning for other sectors as well. I think people are, probably nobody knows, as we discussed before, what the future of offices are. I think there is a future, and it will be a future which should be quite exciting, because we need offices to be an exciting place for people to go to and benefit from. But that market is open again, and there's been some quite interesting transactions that have happened. And even things like retail warehousing has started to sort of trade again, which is good. So I think, you know, in the future we'll probably have a greater demand, as we've seen over the lockdown, for things, you know, which frankly have property with beds, to put it bluntly, which is later living, BTR, hotels probably will come back. One thing we saw over the lockdown when we had our little summer holiday was everybody couldn't wait to book to go away, whether it was in this country or abroad. So I think that, you know, and the other thing which is encouraging is, unlike in the global financial crisis, there's still an awful lot of cash to be deployed. You know, debt is available, although it's a bit more cautious about where it gets deployed, but there's an awful lot of equity out there to be deployed. So, you know, I think investment-wise, the market will bounce back a bit quite quickly, perhaps in a slightly different shape to what it was before, but still, I think things will get going again next year. I think in the occupational markets, if you ignore logistics and industrial offices and so on, will probably take a bit more time for people to decide what they want to do and how long they want to commit. But it will, you know, it will come back. I think, as Sharon said, you know, all businesses need somewhere where you can collaborate and sort of form a sort of company culture, and the office is clearly still going to be the place where that happens, although it might happen in a slightly different way.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to Sandra first. We've only got about 5 minutes left, so I'll warn you of my final question. I think it was Baroness Valentine who suggested we have a levelling up czar. So if you could think of a name for somebody who could do that job before the end of the panel. And then I'm going to ask Sandra to just talk about the property and the way things might change regionally.
Well, I'll try and make it interesting at the beginning, so if I cut off, you'll at least hear half it. I'm sorry about the connection. I'm not sure what's happening, but for me, I think people look at property and how they configure it. So I think the property will be very important to people still, especially in the business world. But whether you're seeing people sit in offices on their own, I think will change. People want more collaborative spacing, I think. People want to be in an environment that's much more inclusive, and you'll see the office changing in the future. From my perspective, I think that's what you'll see. And I think you'll see retailers making, probably if they're going to have space, they'll probably make it much more, again, a combination of retail, coffee, and so on. I think people are going to have to make the experience more interesting going forward.
Yeah. Just one quick one before we get on to our final one. One of the success stories, it seems to me, in London is Baroness Valentine talked earlier about aspiration, and I see businesses working incredibly closely with schools and so on in the city, and I just wondered how that can be replicated, maybe where there isn't such a big, deep business community, because it just strikes me, if you grow up in London nowadays, you might grow up in a poor neighbourhood, but you can see the towers out your window. You feel you can be part of that success story. It's starting to happen in Greater Manchester, arguably now, although there are still communities that feel very cut off from it, even though it's only 10 minutes down the road. Just wondered if you see signs of business rolling its sleeves up and changing that in the regions as well.
Was that a question to me? Or?
Yeah, mainly, because you've probably got the most experience of it.
Right. Yes, I mean, obviously, I'm working with business and community at the moment. So there's a bedrock of business people who have for decades supported their local schools. So that's there. I mean, it's had a bumpy time this year because of the internet. Some of the children you want to help don't have the hardware, don't have the software that they need to actually deal with online. I think if you're on the other side of this equation in local government or in the local enterprise partnership or Department of Education, I very often hear those people saying, "Oh, there's no business locally, we haven't got big business, or can't get a business to do anything." I think that is always absolute rubbish. So there are always people around who are educated and would like to help, who are well off in some region somewhere and would like to help. And there are always businesses actually at the core. You've got Merlin Entertainment at the core of a huge organisation, or the utility companies. Anywhere there are businesses, if you think about it, businesses or business people, if you think about it imaginatively. And so I think there's no excuse. I think for not getting to grips with this, there's a really good, sensible way of doing it now through the Tourism Enterprise Company, and I'm not on the board of that or anything. I just think they're good. And I think every single business person should know about what's going on locally, because there are standards, and it makes a real difference if you've had 4 meetings with business a year or whatever the things are they work to. Absolutely, post-COVID, I think every single business person should be doing something to support their local school.
Yeah, and I'm sure both of you guys your companies do that. Yeah.
Absolutely. We've taken part in professional services weeks where the school children come in and really do experience that environment, and I think it's critical if you're going to get them into believing that they can be part of the sector.
It's quite often with kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, they don't know what they don't know. So it is really key, this communication aspect at a human level as well. You've got to go into those schools and speak to kids. You can't just, which I've done a bit of around where I live, but you can't just rely on, literature or websites or any of that stuff, because it doesn't bring it to life. You've got to actually go and tell them what your day's like and what you actually do and why you like it. And that's the sort of thing that gets them switched on, I think.
Brilliant. Well, we are coming up against the clock, so the levelling up. So, I mean, in a way, it used to be George Osborne when he was in the Treasury, and he had the power to make things happen. And I think we have missed that figure probably in government in the last couple of years. So, any suggestions, Baroness Valentine? You decided, or you could put yourself forward if you wish.
No, I think it needs to be somebody in cabinet. So that's for sure. It sort of ought to be Boris. Maybe the Chancellor. I mean, it sort of needs to be number 10, number 11 cabinet office. Someone who can work across the departments. Anyway, I'm about to go into unjoined up government, but let me not do that. It would have been sort of my classic time in in the old days, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Or to some extent, John Prescott. It's so important, but perhaps it ought to be Boris himself.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Sandra?
Well, I was going to say Boris. So, Valentine, you've stolen my idea. If they're serious, it has to come from the top. It has to be cabinet office driven, and I was going to say Boris needs to drive it as well.
Okay, 2 votes for Boris. Simon?
Well, I think the higher up the chain, probably the better, really, because things get done then, don't they?
Yeah.
So, yeah, somebody like Boris or somebody very senior, I think, is absolutely right.
Yeah, I was hoping for some left field candidates like Dido Harding or something. I don't know. Somebody from the business world, who would get a grip. But anyway, Boris Johnson's not a bad shout if he's got the time. So I would just like to thank our panel for being here. I'm sure everybody else would as well. And obviously the next panel will be up soon. And we hope you've enjoyed this session. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the City UK conference. Thank you very much.